Mathews Center for, and you should have just gotten a notification that we are recording this, and I hope that's all right with all of you. I'm joined by my wonderful team here working to make this exchange happen, and we're excited to have you with us today. And since there's a bunch of you from all over, not necessarily from Alabama, I'd love to just spend 20 seconds and tell you about the Mathews Center for Civic Life. We are a nonprofit organization located in the center of Alabama in a town just south of Birmingham, if you're familiar. We're in the town of Montevallo. However, we actually work all over the state in all 67 counties, and we're thankful for Zoom that it lets us be in even more places than we can physically get to sometimes. We work with Alabamians to develop and implement programs and resources that foster civic education and civic engagement. And our vision is to strengthen civic life in Alabama by increasing active citizenship, community collaboration, and effective decision-making. And we are so fortunate that we are joined by our namesake today, Dr. David Mathews, who until now we have not had too many opportunities to really collaborate and work with one another. But last fall, Dr. Mathews proposed the idea of a monthly conversation series on the topic of the future of democracy, which is why we're all here today. We decided to call these conversations Applied Democracy Exchanges, and we plan to hold them once a month on every third Thursday at 12 p.m. Central Time. And we strategically chose that time hoping people from all over the world can join us, and it would work best for the hours and the difference there. We'll focus on the future of democracy at a local level here in communities in Alabama and within the state. We'll also look at it at a national level, and we hope to connect with others, which clearly we already are, of people around the globe. So we are very excited to have you all with us today. Each month, these conversations will focus on a theme related to democracy. We're interested in bridging the gap between theory and practice, bringing together researchers of democracy and its practitioners who are doing the work on the ground in these communities. We have guest speakers lined up that will include journalists, teachers, researchers, and everyday people from around the world. And what we all have in common is a deep belief in democracy and a concern for its future. So this is where in my notes I said we would share who you are, where you're from, and what you do. But we've already done that. So if you just joined us and you haven't had a moment to type in the chat, we want to know about you and what you do. And so we're just so excited to see all these wonderful faces today. And in just a moment, I want to give you a little format of how I see today going. In just a moment, we're going to hear from Dr. Mathews as he introduces the topic. And then I will introduce our guest speakers and ask them to share about some of the community journalism projects happening here in Alabama. And after that, I want to hear from all of you. We'll take questions from the audience, and I may even have a few questions for you to reflect on. And at any point, if you have any questions that you want to ask, please feel free to type them in the chat and we'll make sure we get to them. Overall, my hope for these exchanges is that we spur some inventiveness. We allow a space for us to think about old problems in a new way. And most importantly, and this is something Dr. Mathews just reminded me, is that these conversations are not a time for a beauty pageant where we're showing off the wonderful things, but instead a chance for us to learn from one another and really discuss what challenges and what failures have we come across, and really use this as an opportunity to highlight those who are working to strengthen democracy. Okay, that's enough for me. Dr. Mathews, I'd like to turn it over to you. Thanks for joining us today, everybody.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. The problems that we're dealing with are all, in one way or another, problems of democracy, which is in real trouble these days. I mean, there are questions now about whether democracy will actually, in the form we know it, will survive. And the problems are getting worse. And that's because we really don't know how to solve them. Nobody's come up with a solution or an answer that will do for all. The one that you're looking at today is particularly acute, and it's the loss of public confidence in our major institutions. the press, most certainly, higher education, the same thing, the scientific establishment. People simply don't trust these institutions or what they say. And that is having a very serious and bad effect on the institutions that we've dealt with before. Since we don't have answers, what we have to do is to make use of our inventiveness. And the real purpose of these exchanges is to spark more creativity and innovation. The United States went through a very difficult time when democracy was truly in danger during the Civil War and the Reconstruction that followed it. But interestingly, about 1890, the early 1900s, there was a burst of civic innovation. Most of the mainline civic organizations, from the NAACP to the General Federation of Women's Clubs, were born in those days. So chaos and turmoil, which we are experiencing now, sometimes sets the stage for innovation and creativity. At the Kettering Foundation, Wednesday mornings, once a month, were devoted to bringing people in from different organizations. I think half a dozen to a dozen were there. And there was no program. There weren't, in the early portion of that, there weren't speakers. People just talked about what they were doing and what they were struggling with and what didn't work. And what it resulted in were fresh insights, new ways to think about old problems. And people use those insights and different perspectives to go out and make some improvements in what they're doing. If that can happen in one place, why can't it happen in others? And this particular project that is being put on by the center in Montevallo is an attempt to see if that environment can be recreated, if we can create something like incubators for innovation. The thing that made them work was a chemistry between people who were basically scholars and thinking about the problems, and people who were very practical. They were doing things that made their communities or their organizations work more democratically. And that chemistry, that interaction was almost magical in that it unlocked ways of thinking, because there were different perspectives, different experiences from people all across the country and around the world. If that can happen in one place, maybe others. Maybe the centers like the one in Alabama would be interested in doing that. I noticed in the list of people to attend, there are other centers represented. I noticed Wendy Lawrence, for example, from a very fine center in Houston, Texas, at the university there. So this is an experiment. And I want to just say a little bit about what makes them work. One is that they are sustained. This is not a one-time conference. This is creating a place that's there month in, month out, year in, year out, where people can go and learn from one another in an exchange and maybe get some new ideas. The second thing, and the most important, is that it was not a beauty contest. People didn't come in to talk about what they had done and get a blue ribbon. They came to talk about what they couldn't get done, what the challenges were. If they came in to, just exhibit what they were doing, people would listen politely, but they weren't sure it would apply to them. But if they talked about problems and mistakes they made, then the conversation got rich and interesting. So the subject today is what's happening to one institution, the press. As I said, it's happening to other institutions, from higher education, colleges and universities, to scientific institutions. So we want to see if this chemistry will occur again, and it will begin, and I really emphasize begin, to create a space for innovation in centers and other organizations around the country. Now, one thing that we didn't have were speakers like me. So I'm not going to say anything more except to say that I'm pleased to see some folks who really know journalism. Paula Ellis had a career with Knight, and she's spearheaded a very interesting way of teaching journalism to students that recognizes some of the problems. Jack Shelton, a friend of mine for long standing, has done some interesting work in community journalism that some of you know very much about. So these exchanges really began with just a couple of people talking about their experience and their problems and their mistakes. And that's often followed by silence. Nothing happens. And that's great, because people are thinking about what they're going to say. So the wheels in their brain have to turn around. So awkward silence is golden. And people will eventually, when they get to the point that they have really some question they want to ask, statement, it will happen. So we're, as far as I'm concerned, I should get off the stage and let those who are talking talk.
Thank you for taking the stage, Dr. Mathews. I know we all were eager to hear from you, and we look forward to any comments that you might want to share later. So let's get started. Today's conversation, the topic is the role of journalism in a functioning democracy. And something I learned while preparing for today's conversation is that at the turn of the 20th century, Alabama had as many as 1,100 newspapers published all around the state. Today, we have lost close to 90% of those papers, which begs the question, are newspapers dead? Is print media dying? And even with all these newspapers closing all over Alabama, as well as the nation, I want to challenge that notion that newspapers are dying by looking at the work of 4 rural communities in Alabama. And at this point, I'd like to introduce 2 of our guests that we have with us today. We have Nan Fairley, Associate Professor of the School of Communication and Journalism at Auburn University. We also have joining us Laura Anderson, Director of Partnerships and Outcomes at the Alabama Humanities Alliance. Thank you both for your time and for contributing to this conversation. And as I mentioned, Nan is an associate professor, which means she has the duty of imparting wisdom to undergraduates at 1 p.m. our time. So we'll make sure we respect Nan's time. But thank you for joining us. So something that, before I give the floor over, just to give a little context, Nan has recently teamed up with Pacers, which is an Alabama nonprofit organization that was founded over 40 years ago to help improve small rural towns. Its mission has now grown to encompass a statewide effort to enhance not only schools, but community life in small towns. Working with Pacers, the project Nan is overseeing is known as the Pacers Rural Community Newspaper Network. This project was born from a result of community deliberations conducted in 5 small towns. The question posed during these meetings was, what is the best thing we can do for our communities? And the answer that they came up with was to publish local newspapers. So Nan, I'll let you take it from here. Can you tell us more about the Pacers Rural Community Newspaper Network? And as you talk, I'm going to put a map up of Alabama and where the 4 communities we're speaking about, where they're located.
Yes, I'm happy to be here this afternoon, and I'm really excited about this project. As somebody who worked in community newspapers and somebody who grew up reading newspapers, it's been really hard to watch as more and more newspapers face challenges, particularly since the advent of the internet. The old-fashioned hold-in-your-hand newspapers have certainly faced a lot of challenges, which is why I'm so excited to be involved with the Pacers Rural Community News Network. As you mentioned, I think it's very, very telling that during these series of community meetings spearheaded by Dr. Shelton, the local residents in these very small towns, they didn't ask for a fire truck, they didn't ask for a new park, they asked for a newspaper. And more impressive than that is that these newspapers are citizen-led, citizen-created. And we have people, 86-year-old editors, we have teenage contributors, all of the content is produced locally. And these are not professional journalists, but they are certainly producing some noteworthy newspapers across Alabama. Right now, we have 4 newspapers in the network. We hope to expand as soon as these newspapers are sustainable, and we think they can be. We think it might be a model not only in Alabama, but for other small rural communities. And also, as you noted, in Alabama history and across the nation, some small towns not only had 1 newspaper, they had 3 newspapers. So it's really been something that's been a loss, I believe, in these towns to lose newspapers. Also, many of these small rural communities are ignored, overlooked. They have stories, rich stories that haven't been told. So I think these newspapers are really giving us an outlet to let those stories come through. We, in our communities, 4 newspapers, Packers Ben, we have a retired school teacher as the editor, Beatrice, also really fun local people involved there. Pent Lala, a retired minister, and his wife are leading the way, and Camp Hill, also senior citizen led. So I think that's been really interesting to see how this works out. In the beginning, after this conversation, we want to have local newspapers. We didn't send professionals in to start the newspapers. We didn't have a great amount of resources. We had 0 resources, to tell the truth, but we started with a little bit of technical assistance, some consulting, and then the local people did all the work. They took it from there. So we've been very excited to see how that's working out. And it goes directly to what Dr. Mathews was speaking about, innovation, creating something new. So I've been impressed with that.
Nan, let me ask you, if I were at a library or a town hall and I picked up one of these copies of the paper, what type of articles would I see? And I'll flip through the front pages of the most recent issues just so everybody can have a look.
Well, so far, we have, I'd call it a treasure trove of local history, has been a great emphasis. We have stories on civic institutions, local government, volunteer fire departments. Another thing that's been particularly impressive is the stories about community health, which is definitely an issue in these communities. The interesting thing is we started during the height of the pandemic, and so far every issue has had locally produced, trustworthy health-related information. And I think that's been something I'm impressed with. Another thing I think these newspapers all do is celebrate achievements. They recognize local residents who have achievements, but they also run articles contributed by people who have moved away to distant places such as Atlanta and Washington, D.C. So we have rocket scientists and mathematicians who have left these communities. And we like to say that the towns where we publish are their communities of the heart. So it keeps them connected to their roots, but it also celebrates how these communities achieve. And so that's been impressive to see.
It sounds so wonderful, but I'm sure there was a lot of hard work and hurdles that you had to overcome. One question I have is, how are these papers distributed? How do you get them in the hands of the readers?
Well, right now, each of the local staff take care of, and they can do this in several ways. They have mailing lists where they send out the papers. They also distribute locally at grocery stores and in the community through town halls. Some are available as email PDFs, and in March, we're going to launch a website that will be part of the network where everybody across the world can read these beautiful papers.
Wonderful. You'll have to share the link with us once it's up and ready for us to look at. It's wonderful. Knowing your professional background and you as an instructor, I'm curious, how do you teach journalists to be community minded?
Well, that's something I've been teaching for 30 years at Auburn, so I'm always emphasizing that place matters. Place matters, and I'm also emphasize the idea that not only people but communities are different. Every community has its own characteristics, and so I think looking for the snowflake factor, what makes Pentlala different from Beatrice, and celebrating that is really important.
Wonderful. Well, before we move on to our next guest, I have one final question for you at this moment, is what role do newspapers play in a thriving democracy?
I think the main answer there is connection. In one of our editors, Gary Burton in Pentlala, said, "We don't know our neighbors anymore." And since the paper started in Pentlala, it has sparked conversation. It sparked softball tournaments. It sparked a lot of things just because people need to know each other. And these community newspapers play a vital role in that. And I think one of our problems on the bigger scene is we're all in our own bubbles. We all get the individual news on our social media feeds, but we don't get the common denominator. As I like to say, we all used to watch one evening news. And so we had something to talk about at the water cooler the next day. We had common content that we could discuss. And I think that's the connection we don't have anymore. And I think that really is a threat to democracy, is that we're not connected because we all live in our own little bubbles. And I think the media plays an important role in connecting people.
Thank you. Laura, keep that in mind. I'm going to ask you that same question in a couple of minutes. But I want to bring Laura Anderson into this conversation. She's joining us from the Alabama Humanities Alliance. And recently they produced a podcast series titled Democracy and the Informed Citizen, which explores the future of journalism in rural Alabama. In a description about the podcast, I found this quote: "Community newspapers may be one of our greatest tools to combat misinformation, help neighbors see past their differences, and sustain a functioning democracy." That being said, Laura, can you tell us about the podcast, why it was created, and what it hopes to accomplish?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I want to just say at the outset, though, I don't think I would have agreed to necessarily be part of this conversation today, other than as a viewer and a participant in conversation, except for the fact that my background is with the Pacers Cooperative, which was the precursor to the nonprofit that is doing the work Nan was just describing. And the relationships that have enabled a lot of this work to get going during the pandemic are quite long. And even before I was a part of that work in the mid-90s, this cooperative got started when Dr. Mathews was president of the University of Alabama. And it really started because rural communities, there was a program then that was part of the university called the Program for Rural Services and Research. And the staff members there, and Jack Shelton, who's been mentioned a few times, and other people who got that work started, were going out into rural Alabama and saying, what would you like? And the answer was they wanted health fairs. They wanted physicians to come to their communities and do mobile health clinic type things. And I just think the roots are important to mention. Because again, that's why I agreed to come on and talk about this podcast, because I didn't just do a podcast. I am not a media producer. I am a public humanities professional, I guess. And I'm an archivist by training. So I'm always interested in what the backstory is on something. And all that said, podcasts are fun to do. I actually would like to do another one, but I don't know if our director really wants us to be in this business or not. How it came about was because being the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, we're part of an organization called the Federation of State Humanities Councils. So every state and territory has a humanities council. And we have a group, an association that, we have a lobbyist and someone who represents us in Congress, and we work together to put forth our interests. And through that federation, we got this opportunity 3 years ago. The Mellon Foundation said, we're partnering with the Pulitzer Prizes, and we want state humanities councils who want to explore this question about the connection between democracy and journalism to give us ideas for what you want to do. So anyway, we put in for that. We got funding. Nan was our lead scholar on this. And we put together this fantastic workshop and all these public programs we were going to do, and they were all going to be in person. So of course, then they became virtual. And then even virtual things were hard to pull off. And I just said, oh my God, in the midst of all of this, the participants in these programs over the last 2 years were from all over Alabama. They were from urban and rural communities, but they were interested in looking at what is journalism in a rural context, and how do we make up for what we see as all these things that are lacking. Some of the Pacers members in the communities we've been talking about today, and thank you for putting up the map, that was good. They were just a few of the participants in all of these workshops. We had training on solutions journalism. We don't probably have time to get into what that is necessarily, but we were offering some practical training to the degree that we could as a humanities council, because what we try to do is offer context and get people to think about figuring out what the context is for something before they jump into it. So we're interested in the roles of history and literature and philosophy and the history of fill in the blank, any topic in human experience would be, and applying that to an issue. The issue here is the dearth of newspapers anymore, or news sources. When we say paper, it doesn't have to be paper. And again, this loss of community. We have all this social media and people are tuned in to all this stuff all the time, supposedly, and yet we're feeling more isolated, and we're talking about how we don't know each other anymore. I think there are misconceptions about urban and rural community dwellers. And, people think, oh, if you live in a city, you don't know your neighbors, and rural communities do. Rural communities don't, because you get up in the morning and you've got to drive 30 or 40 miles to work and come back at the end of the day. How much time do you have to get to know your neighbors? And meanwhile, everything Nan said is true about how we receive information and get in our bubbles that have more to do with our interests and inclinations than they do with getting to know other people. And so I'm talking too much, but that's how this podcast came to be, because we were faced with a situation of wanting to wrap up this multi-year project and not really wanting to do any more public programs and trainings, but wanting to step back and focus on something that had grown up during the pandemic, which was these 4 newspapers.
Well, and we'll be sure to share the link to the podcast should any of you be interested to listen. But each episode focuses on a different one of these communities, and then one episode focuses on journalism professors. And it really talks about the struggles and the story of each of these papers. But I would encourage anybody interested to have a look at it, have a listen to it, because it really is really informative and really tells the story of what Pacers has been up to. So I guess before I move on to questions about turning this from a beauty pageant to let's talk about the real challenges. Laura, let me ask you, what does community journalism, what role does it play in democracy? Same question I had for Nan.
I think it's frightfully fundamental.
Okay.
Yeah. I tune in, I have my subscriptions to the Washington Post and New York Times, but man, what I really need is a neighborhood newspaper. I really need to know what's going on in my immediate area, because I think if democracy can function on a hyper-local level, it's less likely to fail on our national level.
Absolutely. And that's a really good point. And I'm really curious for everybody in our conversation today, where do you get your news from? Do you have a local newspaper that is printed that you have access to? If you want to answer this question, I'd love to hear it. You can put it in the chat and we'll have a look at it. But I am curious, are you seeing the same decline in newspapers in your area or in your country that we're seeing here? And with that, I think let's turn off the beauty pageant and let's talk about the real challenges, because it sounds like a lot of work, especially Nan, the past few years working on this project. What would you say the main challenge or the hardest challenge that you've been facing? And you've got a lot of experts here, so bring your problems to us. Let's see if we can solve them.
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with resources and funding. We're looking for grants and support. The cost of publishing has always been a major factor in the newspaper business. It's usually one of the highest expenses to put that printed copy out. And we want these newspapers to be self-sustaining. And so that means that we are going to have to deal with the same business model problem that newspapers have, which is finding advertising or some other nonprofit type support to make it sustainable. So I think that's a big problem. So, but we think we're going to be innovative and try to work around that. And one of our problems is a lot of the people in the communities are senior citizens. They're in their 80s and 70s, and like me, they're they have other things to do, but we are working on getting more young people involved. And thanks to Dr. Mark Wilson, we have a program connecting first generation college, high school students to possibly bring them in as interns so more of this intergenerational staff building is a problem. And I think beyond that, it's this technical, these are citizen journalists. And so we do have writing workshops and design workshops, but there are some technical, we want it to be citizen journalism, but we want to have professional quality. So we have to deal with that.
So for communities that might want to replicate what you've done with these local newspapers, how can they find funding? Where have you found your funding?
Well, Pacers had a little bit of funding, but mainly in the startup, we provided a computer consulting and some technical advice. But what we're hoping to do is learn all the lessons we can from these 4 startup newspapers to create a model that can be replicated in other small communities in a reasonable way. So we're hoping to develop a model and develop a network that we can share information, because 4 communities on their own is different from 4 communities networking together. For example, to share health related information and other lessons that can be learned in how they produce the newspapers. So I think that's the next step: sustainability and networking.
Thank you. So I would love to hear what questions everybody has. And while you're thinking of them, I'm going to ask Laura if she has anything she wants to add about the challenges. Because Laura, I know with the podcast, you've spent a lot of time with these writers, these citizen journalists. So you know what challenges they faced. Is there anything you would add to what Nan has said?
I want to say a challenge for us as a humanities organization to have any kind of role in this was that the connection between humanities disciplines and journalism was really called into question by a lot of people, even in our own community. Like, what do the humanities have to do with journalism? And I found it difficult to answer that. And I think that's because of the professionalization of everything that humans do anymore. Journalism certainly being one of those things. And so we get into this mindset where we're thinking of journalism as a J school type of journalism. And over the course of this project, I now feel really relieved because I understand that what we're talking about is building goodwill. Those are the words that Gary Burton used, but that helped me so much. If you listen to the podcast, anybody, it's episode 1. So you don't even have to listen to the whole series to hear Gary Burton talking about what he's trying to do in his community. The challenge he was facing, how to build goodwill, not just because we're challenged to know one another, but because of the atmosphere, this divisive atmosphere we're all living in that is fed by the national media, and this culture we've all created for ourselves at this point in our history. And so I'm not answering your question, sorry, and not exactly, but I just wanted to say that what we're talking about is, and when y'all look at the papers online, thank you, Haley, for putting the links to the papers, because those are what you need to see. We're talking about people, what were the words Mary Howard used? Opening the community up to itself. She's the producer of the Beatrice paper. Yes. Opening the community up to itself. That's what this is all about. And building goodwill, not covering, quote, the news, which is the way that I had entered into this whole project, because I live at this point in the 21st century, and I think of news as something like with a capital N or in all caps or something. And I never went to journalism school. I understand that what we all need is to know one another.
Thank you. That's very well said. I'm excited to hear from our audience joining us because I've seen so many people in their video nodding their head along with what you two have been saying. So I'd love to hear from if anybody has any comments or questions for our guest. Now is the time, and you're welcome to just unmute yourself and chime in.
I have a question for Nan. I first would acknowledge that I value very highly the local newspapers where we have lived and worked. In fact, I still get a copy of the Auburn Opelika News, the electronic edition of that. But I wondered if in your work, there are two sources of income for operating a local newspaper. One is advertising revenue, and second is subscriptions from individuals who want to receive it. What has been your understanding of when small newspapers decline or fold, I should say? Is it because they have a lack of advertising revenue or a lack of subscribers?
Well, the majority of revenue comes from advertising, but advertising depends on the number of subscribers. So as your subscriptions go down, your appeal to people with money to advertise goes down. So it's kind of a vicious cycle, but the majority does come from advertising.
Thank you, Dr. Muse. Harry Boyd, I see your hand is raised.
Thanks. So, I mean, I think this is a great topic. I'm wondering if taking what we call an organizing approach rather than simply an informational approach might be one way to strengthen and build bases for local newspapers. So if a local newspaper has many functions, one of which is being a community meeting ground, as both Laura and Nan said, place where people come together and learn about each other and make connections and maybe spin off something, a project. But talking to groups, in addition to advertising, although it could help advertising and subscriptions, talking to groups like a community foundation or a local school or local businesses. I mean, going out and talking to them and asking what might be their interest, their self-interest in strengthening or keeping the local newspaper going. We've had good experience with that with libraries, which tend to have a notion that people should come to them for information, but actually the people in libraries like Riverview in St. Paul, in the middle of an immigrant neighborhood now, they learn to go out and talk to immigrants and say, what is your interest in the local library? And it really revitalized the library and also created all sorts of new projects. So I'm simply thinking, do you see room for that kind of organizing approach? And I should say my computer is crashing, so I'm going to have to go in a minute.
A suggestion, community organizing, you have an expert in the group on that. He taught Barack Obama community organizing in Chicago. John McKnight was going to join us. Can you reach him? He would be very relevant to what you're talking about.
I'm here, Dave. Can you hear me?
Fine.
Okay. Well, one thing that comes to me so vividly from what we're talking about right now is we're very interested in how you build a neighborhood culture. as against just a neighborhood organization that is a set of programs rather than something that is more indigenous and long lasting. And one of the main factors we think is a local newspaper. It is a source for increasing the possibility of a culture in a neighborhood. And I've written a little piece about this, but let me say that I read the Chicago Tribune, which is, I think, the biggest hold in your hand newspaper in the Midwest. And I read it every day. And then I also have a home in a little town in Wisconsin that has a newspaper, comes out once a week. So I read these two newspapers, and the Chicago Tribune has opens with a Chicago section. And in general, about 70% of what it's telling about is crime and or high conflict in the political system. Right? Then we go to our home in Wisconsin and we read this little 12-page paper. And nothing that appears in the Tribune appears in the 12-page paper. So it leaps out to you all of a sudden that each of these is a mirror presented to people about who they are. Opening, somebody said that you're opening, the newspaper's opening it as to who we are. Well, Spring Green is a place where people think it's peaceable and everybody's contributing, because most everything that's reported is about various kinds of clubs, associations, and groups, and city council are doing things. And every year there's a crime, right? And even there, the newspaper editor puts it on page 7, right? So what I think we need to recognize is that newspapers give us a mirror of who we are. And in building a culture, that constant messaging about our collective contributions is a major force in getting collective contributions, right? I live in an active little town, and in Chicago, nobody does anything but kill each other. Right? So that's an observation.
Very good.
Thank you very much. I see a couple of other hands raised. So let's see, Ike Adams, thanks for joining us. Do you have, and then we'll go to Mr. Hammer after that.
Hello, I am Ferenc Hammer, calling from Hungary. At this moment, I'm at the Milan airport, so I'm very happy that I can contribute because my boarding is just about starting. So, and also I'm very happy that I can reply to the previous contribution about this bucolic sense of the community and the community news, etc. Don't forget the Lord of the Flies, the novel, about what community-minded youngsters can do each other if they don't have any sense of where they are really. And my idea with also some experience with local public sphere and local culture is very often what happens in the community is basically one way or another is somehow a translation of how the community links itself with the wider public, with the wider culture, with the wider nation, what kind of newspapers they are reading, And sometimes the result is, sorry to say, very bad. So for instance, when the Hungarian government started doing a political campaign against asylum seekers as refugees who are going to steal our money and wives and everything, and then in local communities where they've never seen a person whose white was not, whose skin was not white. They started setting up community guard units to protect the village from the refugees. You see, so again, and there was very nice direct communication within the community. They were communicating probably with on the internet, and they had a Facebook page or something, and the result was really awful. So, and but at the same time, my local media is the national media because I'm from Budapest, and that's the same for people who are living in big metropolitan cities. So again, what is local, what is national, again, is blurring in this case. So, but at the same time, I tend to argue with colleagues who say that if this total transformation of the communication sector in the local media and the media, when, for instance, people are arguing whether Facebook is a channel or an editorial office, or if it's a billboard, you know, they cannot decide. All these kind of transformations and the detrimental effect for the public sphere has created way more serious situations in the local level, in the local media. So very often there is no solution, and that's why I dropped a link to the chat about an interesting and in a way very funny experiment in Hungary. It's called Print It Yourself. It's basically they're bringing news for people who don't use the internet. So and the idea is to print the internet into A4 format and throwing it to people's mailboxes. So
Interesting.
the word is very interesting. Yeah, all right. The article is in German, but you can translate it easily with Google Translate or something. Okay,
Thank
and
you.
now I think
Thanks.
in a couple of minutes I'm getting on my plane. So I was very happy to see you guys.
We're honored that you made time to join us. Safe travels. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
So let's see. Ike Adams, did you have a question you wanted to ask or a comment to ask?
I did. This has really been interesting. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was pleased to hear that Laura is going to take the opportunity to look at what they have previously done and with the 4 newspapers. And I think the challenge for some of us, especially those of us who are in rural communities, is there's this tendency to think about bringing to scale and using essentially the typical models to bring to scale. And they tend to, am I still there?
Yes.
And they tend to relate to urban areas. So I'm hoping that Laura and others, as they look at these, I'm assuming some of the newspapers in rural communities, I'm hoping, and one of the things you said, Laura, was that there's sort of like this, in order to get the advertisements, they look at the number of people who are looking at the papers, and then that increases the ability for someone to deal with the resources that you need for, and that puts us in a difficult situation if you're in a rural community. So I'm curious about how you are addressing that, and if you can share that kind of information, because not on the scale in newspapers, but scale in all of the areas that we have to deal with in
Right.
rural communities.
Well, that's certainly on our agenda to do that. Make sure that we track what we're doing, but also look at the big picture of how issues that aren't being covered anywhere really matter to these tiny communities.
Is there
If-
anyone?
If I understood what Ike was saying, though, I have to say, and maybe I didn't. But what I love about these papers is the same thing that I love about what I learned, trying to tell a little bit of the story of their evolution through the podcast, which is that we don't have to be like newspapers. We have to do the job that we need done, which is help one another get to know one another. So when I heard the word scale, that's what I thought he was talking about. And I love the rural quality, if I could say that, of these papers. And of the people who are putting them together every month. And that community of the heart that Nan mentioned. Nan is also Laura, so that gets confusing.
Yeah.
But that the community of the heart being the people who have had to move away because of economic circumstances, really, it's the core reason, but they still care very much about the place that made them who they are. And they're not, the places they're from are still there, and they're not trying to be something they're not. But too often, like, I appreciated what the guy in Budapest was saying, and it's so hard to imagine the scenario he was describing, because there's just been an absence of any news or paper or outlet for people to know one another as a community in the places where we are. So.
Thank you. I see 3 hands raised, and then I have 1 question in the chat, but let's go to Dr. Muse first. I saw your hand up first.
Just a quick follow-up on my earlier question and comment, question to Nan. 2 sources of revenue for a local newspaper weekly, let's say, subscribers and advertising revenue. I would suspect that if your subscriber list declines, then the attractiveness of spending money to advertise in that newspaper also goes down dramatically. So if a local newspaper can maintain a large subscription list, and one would just suspect or would hope that people who live in the local community are probably more interested in what goes on in that local community than they are in the large city away from them. So why have people quit subscribing to local newspapers?
Well, actually, within the past decade, the small town newspapers have really done better than the large metro papers in terms of losing subscriptions. But I think the invention of the printing press caused a great revolution. And I think the invention of the internet caused the next a huge revolution in everything from banking to how we're getting together today. I mean, so it's been a revolution, a technical revolution that we've had to deal with, but also still in smaller communities, citizens love their local newspapers. They trust their local newspapers. And I think that's the case. However, some of the challenges that have to do with that is corporations buying up the local newspapers because they were profitable. And then it becomes part of a chain. And then it has to answer to stockholders. And so there's all kinds of pressures that we didn't have with family-owned newspapers. So I'm not sure that answered your question, but I think we need innovation on that front for sure.
Thank you.
you. And Noelle, I see your hand is up. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. So, and thank you for holding these starting to hold these meetings. It's always good to see new people and old faces and favorite faces like David Mathews' face. I would say in a way and actually to answer that last question and to kind of frame the whole discussion would be to not think of newspapers and other institutions as separate institutions, but to think of them as channels for people to participate in common life. So in my work, I'm a professor of philosophy. And anybody who's been in meetings with me before, people joke that whenever I talk, I mention Hannah Arendt. I wasn't going to mention Hannah Arendt because of that, but well, I just did. But she has this idea of the lost treasure of the American Revolution. And whatever you think of the American Revolution, pick your favorite revolution. The lost treasure of a revolution is when people are able to take part in creating something new. And they have this, what she called public happiness that comes from that. I also do a lot of work in psychoanalytic theory to understand political problems. And I've been trying to think, how do we use psychoanalytic theory to think about solutions? So one idea is simply that, we are desiring libidinal creatures who want to feel good, right? And sometimes those ways we want to feel good are not socially acceptable. So we might need to find more socially acceptable ways to feel good. Freud called that sublimation, to turn a drive into something that was socially valued. So, we might write books or start a podcast or a newspaper or write a column, or so it's something that is a way to, actually it's the same thing that Aram was talking about. It's a way of becoming happy through putting our energy into public things. So it also goes back to, Aristotle thinks that we're really fully human. We're able to engage in political matters with other people. So I think all of those things point to thinking this. So I'm slightly disagreeing with the way that David framed it at the very beginning, though what I'm talking about, I also learned from David. Another way he thinks is that these are not separate institutions. And the problem is that they've lost our trust. The problem becomes when they become separate institutions and not some place in which we can channel our own desire for public value and worth. So that, I think that when y'all were talking about, where did she go? The other speaker, talking about, she had to go teach a class, talking about that a lot of the stories are written by citizens and not professionals. That's what makes it really a channel for public happiness, is when people can take part in it and be excited to produce something for their community. The problem becomes like, well, what about objective standards, blah, blah, blah. But, people can take up principles and incorporate them in their work without having to be a professional. So I think just trying to connect this and for the future things that we talk about month after month, how to connect these and how to find ways for people to find that they have a place there and a role there.
Yeah.
Thank
you. Thank you for your comments. So I see two questions in the chat that I'll just pose, and if anybody has any comments you'd like to add. One is from German Ruiz. How do we overcome the use and sometimes abuse of social media to overpass special interest control of traditional journalism? I'm somewhat surprised that we haven't talked about too much already, misinformation and the abuse of social media, but does anybody have any comments on that topic?
Well, if I can say something, I'm still here. My
Wonderful.
thing is delayed. Next week, we are going to organize a big international conference in Budapest as a kind of closing event for our fact-checking operation, which is supported by the European Union, University, AFP, the French News Agency, and some other organizations. And it was basically the first big fair say fact-checking enterprise in Hungary, because fact-checking is the thing that everybody is doing, you know, like lawyers are doing fact-checking, journalists are doing fact-checking, the police is doing fact-checking, judges are doing fact-checking. So it's like, but at the same time, it was very interesting to see how this whole infrastructure so how this whole infrastructure of news making, news consumption, commentary, and everything reacted to fact checking, and unfortunately, in a way, our work is one of the sad conclusions to our work is, however, we've done. I mean, the journalists, because we academics were doing some background work. In a way, we were replicating already existing structures. So the bubble filter culture has got, in a way, reinforced because we started, the journalists were doing fact checking for all the spectrum of the political fields. So left wing, right wing, centrist, whatever, fascist, whatever you have around. But since it was funded by the European Union, already the government media has labeled us the little puppies of George Soros and, you know, all this kind of thing. So, but it was just the first year, in a way, a little more the first year. So, so I was just wanted to tell this because you were just asking about fact check. And so it's an interesting experience. Anyone is interested, I can send you stuff and things like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the final question that I see in our chat is actually from Karma Tolliver, who is joining us from Birmingham's WBHM, which she is asking, is there a way to make producing a community or local newspaper be a tax break for some businesses? This is somewhat of a technical question, but somebody might have the answer. I think it's a good avenue to research, go down. Maybe I'll have one of my team members look into it. But
I mean, Pacers is a nonprofit, so if someone, you know, made a donation sizable enough, I guess it would affect their taxes, but that's a good question. I wanted to say, just to throw it in there, in answer to the last question about social media, I have a 14-year-old and he's grown up here in Birmingham. He went to Birmingham City Schools for the last 10 years. He has nothing to do with social media, doesn't want to, doesn't see any use in it. And so I just think that's interesting. I'm on social media. My husband and I are in our 50s and we're, you know, kind of typical about it. And I think it's kind of a drag, but I know I got to be on there for work and stuff like that. But I don't know if that, and I have a friend who teaches at a local university who says she has to make her students create social media accounts in order to participate in some of her class assignments that have to do with, you know, discussing the role of social media in our culture. So they're not on there. I think that's interesting, but they're on other things. I mean, it's a generational divide in terms of who uses what. I understand that, but there's hope. I say throw it all out myself, but no, I'm kidding.
I'd like to add about the social media and the kind of journalism that we're interested in, that I think what has happened is that a lot of the functions of a hold in your hand newspaper have been relocated to the social media. In my town, Evanston, Illinois, about 90,000 people. You can go to the internet and find 5 separate things that are information sources about our community.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, there's been a migration, but I can find out many of the same things that I used to get in a hold your hand newspaper on the social media. And one of the interesting questions is, why do we have 5? I mean, if we have out there 5 groups of people somehow who every week at least are putting out information that is useful to me as an Everstonian, very parochial, then what we really do have is an image maker and a migrated form of information. And what do we do with that? Maybe that's where we should be focusing. I don't know.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Mathews.
Is Paula Ellis still around? I was interested in how all of this is affecting the way young journalists are prepared. Paula, are you still with us?
I'm not sure if I see her.
Well, something to follow up on is this experiment by Paula and a lot of support from the Knight Foundation. I'm sure Paula has some literature or something on that, but that might be an interesting part of it. John McKnight also is a genius in his efforts to stomp out social work. He used to say that part of his objective in life was to end social work. Well, why would John want to do that? He seems like a nice enough fellow. It was because social work is based on assessing people's needs. Okay, so the professionals would go into a neighborhood that was poor, and they would make a list of everything that they needed. And the people who were poor knew they were poor. And once they saw the report, they were just flattened by it. So he invented asset-based analysis. And people would go into communities and say, what is it that you can do? Well, there were all kinds of things. I can bake a pie, I can fix a car, I can weave a chair. And he found all of those people in this neighborhood where everybody had been homeless for generations. He found jobs for them within 4 or 5 blocks of where they lived. So he created something called asset-based community development. Now, what if you went into a community with an asset-based perspective and you looked at what people did to communicate, connect with one another, and develop goodwill? What assets were there? And then what do newspapers or the press or something, do they have some role in that? No idea. But what you want to happen in these sessions is to raise people curiosity, to identify things that they want to continue talking about. And maybe the list of people who signed up is available some way so that they can continue the conversations.
Yes, we'd be happy to make that available. In fact, I'm thinking we'll create a Google folder and share all these resources that I've seen have been shared in our chat and give you access to everything in case you want to continue this conversation. Wonderful. Well, I think this has been a very productive conversation. Does anybody have anything you would like to add before we wrap up for the day? I take the silence as a good thing, like Dr. Mathews mentioned in the beginning, that it's time for us to be silent and now think about what we discussed. So we look forward to continuing these conversations the third Thursday of every month at the same time. If you have any topics that you're interested in, please let us know. We would love to really see how these conversations kind of develop organically and see what topics we're interested in discussing. But we look forward to seeing you all next month.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you,
Yeah,
Dr.
well, like I said, I'd already signed up to come, so I just got to talk more than other people. That was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.